African witchcraft, Catholic saints, and Mexican drug cartels. Typically, you wouldn't think they have anything in common, but that's because you've never heard of Santa Muerte. This is a spiritual movement that the Catholic Church calls satanic and 5 million people call salvation. Mexico's beloved and feared folk saint of death. She's got tattoos on cartel soldiers, candles on abuelita's kitchen counters, and altars set up next to Bibles and bullets. Is Santa Muerte just the Grim Reaper, or is she hiding African spirits behind her robe? We'll go into how enslaved Africans, indigenous Mexicans, and Spanish colonizers all unknowingly built her cult together, and we'll explain why a skeleton might actually offer more hope than the Pope. It's history, it's mysticism, and it is more relevant today than you might think. So sit back, relax, and welcome to camp. What's up, people, and welcome back to camp. My name is Mark Gagnon, and thank you for joining me in my tent, where every single week we explore the most interesting, fascinating, controversial stories from around the world, from all time, ever. I'm joined by my dear friend Gabe on the ones and threes. Gabe, how are you?
Great.
All right. Guys, no time to waste because we are jumping into one of the most fascinating, scary, and controversial religious movements happening today. This is wild, and we're going through everything. It's called Santa Muerte. And over the past 30 years or so, this movement has been spreading across North and South America and in the Caribbean region. But today's video, we will just be focusing on Mexico. A skeleton saint that has captured the hearts of millions and millions of people. But where does this figure come from, right? Like, you've maybe seen the image before. Well, we're going to dig through everything. The word diaspora refers to people who are scattered from their original homeland. In this case, it describes the millions of Africans who were enslaved and forced to leave their home continent. These displaced people brought their spiritual beliefs with them, creating religions like Voodoo in Haiti, or Santeria in Cuba, or Palo Monte Mayombe or Obea in Jamaica, and Spiritism throughout Latin America. And each of these traditions represents how African people adapted their original spiritual practices to survive in new and often hostile environments. Surprisingly, researchers have barely scratched the surface when it comes to studying how these African-rooted traditions may have influenced Santa Muerte's development. Trying to understand how different religious traditions blend together is like trying to put together a puzzle, right? It's never simple because spiritual beliefs don't follow neat categories and clear timelines. However, we can build on what scholars have already learned about Santa Muerte's origins, symbols, and rituals to uncover what these hidden African influences are. So, when different spiritual traditions combine, it's not some random accident. Real people make deliberate choices about which ideas and practices to blend together. What many scholars will call syncretism is actually completely normal. It happens whenever people from different backgrounds come together and need to make sense of the world. In the case of Santa Muerte, we'll explore how the ancient process created something entirely new, yet very familiar to the past. Historically in Mexico, aspects of blackness have been excluded from nationalist ideologies despite the overwhelming presence of Africans in this country known as New Spain. African slaves were brought to New Spain as early as 1501, and during the first 200 years of its existence, it received an average of 2/3 of all African slaves brought to Spanish America. The majority of these slaves were men, which eventually led to their propagation of mixed-race children with indigenous women. The interracial relationships between African-descended people and the native population is multifaceted and complex, and it is additionally complicated by the caste system that is ever present in colonial New Spain. This sistema de castas, basically a social hierarchy based on racial classification, oftentimes known as colorism, continues to influence race relations within Mexico today. Spanish slave owners were obligated to oversee their slaves' quote, religious training, as the New World's conversion was one of the main concerns of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church at the time. Slaves were required to be baptized before or immediately upon arriving. And while religion helped abolish enslavement of the natives, it justified African enslavement by associating blackness with descent from the cursed Canaanites of the Bible, who were, quote, condemned to perpetual bondage. This sets up a dichotomy of sanctioned versus unsanctioned domains with colonial society. So a sanctioned domain being the biased judicial system to which the populace was accountable, and the unsanctioned domain being occupied by witchcraft practiced by the natives and probably the newly arrived Africans as well. The practice of witchcraft in the unsanctioned domain offset the racial bias of the judiciary in the sanctioned domain by allowing the bottom levels of the caste system to seek retribution as well as healing. This unsanctioned activity continues to this day as practitioners of African diasporan traditions as well as Santa Muertes and how they attempt to manipulate the world they live in through ritual activities. These ritual activities are perpetually reworked within each practitioner's cultural, economic, and their political environment to fit the changing needs. This aspect of individual agency at the hands of the historically oppressed is the most common thread linking the Santa Muerte cult to other syncretic religious traditions, especially those of the African diaspora. So, what does Santa Muerte mean? I mean, it literally means holy death or saint death in Spanish, and most scholars agree that Saint Death is a better translation because her followers treat her just like other folk saints found throughout Mexico. A folk saint is different than an official Catholic saint. They're usually spirits of dead people who become famous after death for performing miracles or something else that would make them known through a specific place. What makes them special is that regular people, not the Catholic Church, is what is decided to make them a saint. It's also worth noting within the Catholic Church, saints are not worshipped, they're just sort of admired and revered because they're people that lived great lives on earth, whereas these folk saints are in many ways worshipped throughout parts of Mexico. Two other skeletal folk saints exist in Latin America, San La Muerta in Argentina and Rey Pascual in Guatemala. But unlike these male figures, most people don't believe Santa Muerte was ever a real person. Instead, she represents death itself, like death as this almost, iconic, powerful force. And the idea isn't new necessarily. In Spain, death has long been personified as a female skeleton called La Parca. This tradition of honoring folk saints in Latin America connects directly to both indigenous and African practices of worshiping ancestors after they die. Kevin Fries, a researcher at Fort Leavenworth, described the Santa Muerte movement as ritual practices offered to a supernatural personification of death. And it's kind of wrapped up to look like a religious movement. Interestingly, this description could apply to a ton of different African diasporan religions as well. So the main theory suggests that Santa Muerte comes from these African spiritual traditions. So again, when slaves come over from Africa into Mexico, they bring with them many different ideas of, animism or polytheism. And with that, it begins to influence the surrounding areas. And like we mentioned before, Santeria in Cuba, Paulo Monte Mayombe from Brazil, Voodoo from Haiti. All of these religions mixed African spiritual practices with Catholicism or Christianity, and it's exactly what we see with Santa Muerte. More specifically, Santa Muerte might be connected to specific African deities, such as Oya, which is the Santeria goddess of storms, or Yewa, the Santeria goddess of the underworld who delivers bodies to Oya, or the Santella Ndoki, which is the Palo Monte cemetery ruler similar to Oya, or Maman Brigitte, a voodoo spirit who's also connected to Oya. So all of these different entities or spirits or deities within these different disparate religions could be also connected to the Santa Muerte idea. Another theory traces Santa Muerte back to ancient Aztec gods, two of them, Mictlantecutli and Mictlantecuhtli, the Lord and Lady of the Dead. These skeletal deities ruled Mictlan, known as the Aztec underworld. And when Spanish colonizers arrived, they banned this worship during the Inquisition. The practice went underground and may have reemerged as Santa Muerte worship in recent decades. Another theory proposed by Mexican scholars, including David Romo, considered the godfather of the Santa Muerte movement, believes she comes from the medieval European images of the Grim Reaper. During the 1300s, the Black Plague killed 1/3 of Europe's population. This tragedy led to the first images of death as a skeletal figure. Spanish priests brought this imagery to the Americas and used it to teach both indigenous people and enslaved Africans about Christianity. When indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans encountered these Christian images of death, they interpreted them through their own spiritual beliefs. Some groups even saw the skeleton figure as a saint. Both indigenous and African peoples had to be clever about practicing their traditional religions under Spanish rule. They often disguised their original deities as Catholic saints so that they could continue their spiritual practices without persecution. This survival strategy created the mixed religious traditions we see today, including Santa Muerte. What's up, guys? We're going to take a quick break because I have great news. Religion Camp has merch. That's right. We have amazing t-shirts like this one you see here and this one. We got hats, all sorts of very interesting designs, not only for Christianity, the one I was raised in, but for all religions: Hinduism, Sikhism, Islam, Judaism, Mormonism. I actually don't know if we have a Mormonism shirt, but maybe we can work on that if we got any, Latter-day Saints trying to cop. Anyway, you can catch it all here at this link. We'll also have it in the description as well as the comments. Get that right now, and peace be with you. When Spanish colonizers take control of Mexico, the Catholic Church banned the worship of skeleton saints during the Inquisition, and the practice was forced completely underground, but it doesn't disappear completely. The first official mention of Santa Muerte appears in Inquisition documents from 1790, proving that people continued worshiping her in secret. After that, Santa Muerte vanished from historical records for over 150 years, and she didn't reappear until the 1940s or 50s, when 4 anthropologists mentioned her in their research. Interestingly, the Santa Muerte these researchers described was characterized by the color red and focused exclusively on love and romance. Her followers called her the, quote, powerful lady of love. This color symbolism, using specific colors for different types of requests, is a key feature of Santeria and voodoo, suggesting African influence on her worship. Research from the 1960s and 70s confirmed that Santa Muerte worship had spread to every region of Mexico. What started as a hidden practice had quietly become a nationwide phenomenon. And today, Santa Muerte has exploded into the mainstream. She now has approximately 2 to 5 million followers, and that number continues to grow. You can find altars throughout Mexico and the United States through Mexico's Tepito neighborhoods, remaining as the center of her worship. Even some Catholic churches have become less resistant to Santa Muerte worship, particularly in the white form. This is shocking because the official Catholic Church has condemned her as satanic in the past. It's also worth noting that African-derived religions routinely adopt local saints and deities, so this kind of religious mixing, again, is pretty common in those traditions. And the mainstream media often tries to link Santa Muerte with drug trafficking, but the reality is much more complicated. People from all walks of life worship her, from housewives to business owners to students. And one reason for her popularity is her moral flexibility. Unlike many traditional Catholic saints, Santa Muerte doesn't judge her followers' requests, whether someone is asking for love or money or protection or even revenge. She's seen as willing to help without moral criticism. This non-judgmental attitude mirrors a lot of African Caribbean religious traditions such as Santeria and Voodoo. And in these religions, the spirits, called the Orishas or the Iwa, are viewed as approachable because they have almost human-like characteristics. They enjoy earthly pleasures and, understand human desires. And Santa Muerte has been thoroughly Mexicanized by her followers. She enjoys characteristically Mexican food, tequila, cigars, chocolate. Her followers also constantly update her wardrobe with new styles and colors. And this customization isn't, again, just a Santa Muerte detail. In Cuban Santeria, for example, the African Orisha's clothing becomes, very European looking over time, and followers continue to change and update these wardrobes to this day. Santa Muerte's recent popularity explosion coincides with Mexico's political and economic problems. The country is facing, escalating drug cartel violence and governmental inability to control crime and natural disasters and epidemics and decreased tourism due to safety concerns. And all of these overwhelming difficulties mirror the hardships that many people throughout Mexico have faced in history. I mean, Obviously a much worse example, but enslaved Africans, when they arrived in the New World, these displaced people turned their spiritual traditions and looked to them for survival. Modern Mexicans have also turned to Santa Muerte for protection and guidance. Now, here's what makes this phenomenon so interesting. Santa Muerte is worshipped both by people involved in drug trafficking and by people seeking protection from those same criminals. And this contradiction actually explains the popularity, right? She's flexible and can serve anyone's needs without judgment. Santa Muerte worship doesn't have an official church or an organization, but that doesn't mean that it's disorganized. In fact, the rituals are very structured and detailed. Countless prayer books and guides have been written to help followers worship her correctly, and Santa Muerte's devoted followers see her as a protector. But they're not seeking spiritual enlightenment like you might find in other religions. Instead, they want concrete favors and rewards, things like protection from enemies, help finding love, success in business, or healing from some type of illness. And here's a key rule. Everything you ask Santa Muerte comes at a price. The bigger your request, the bigger your offering needs to be. It's like a spiritual transaction. You give her something valuable, and she will help you in return. So followers have developed specific ways to ask for help. They've developed colored candles. So different colored candles represent different types of requests. So for example, red candles are love, white for protection, black for revenge. Or you can do material offerings. So people will bring, specific gifts to the altar depending on what they need. And the more valuable or meaningful the gift, the better the chances are that their wish will be granted. Some followers will even get tattoos of Santa Muerte as an offering of their own skin and blood. Others will, wear jewelry of her image or carry small statues for protection. And here's where this gets complicated. So for many Santa Muerte followers, they also consider themselves Catholic, and they often use traditional Catholic prayers when they talk to her. They'll invoke the Trinity and even use rosaries around her statues. However, the official Catholic Church strongly condemns Santa Muerte worship, calling it satanic and saying that she has no place in Christianity. And despite this, some smaller churches in specific, rural areas have even started using some of the iconography of Santa Muerte into some of the services. And this blending of Catholic and non-Catholic is exactly what happened with Santeria and Voodoo in different parts of the world. So the altar setup for Santa Muerte is very specific, okay? You have money, which is a cash offering to show, the seriousness of the request, or fresh flowers. Any type is acceptable, but they must be fresh to show respect. And then you can do alcohol, which has to be served in the proper glassware, not just straight from the bottle. Cigars and cigarettes should be left burning at the altar, and this is a common purification ritual that involves blowing smoke over the statue. And this is also done in Santeria and in Voodoo. Fruit can be, personalized by color to match the specific request we mentioned before. And then bread, water, and incense are some of the most essential offerings that you can put onto the altar. Water also deserves kind of a special mention because it's considered the most important offering in some ways. It should come straight from the tap, not bottled water, and should never be allowed to run dry. Keeping fresh water on the altar shows an ongoing devotion and respect. And what makes Santa Muerte worship unique is how personal and direct it feels to the followers. Followers aren't going through priests or church channels. They're building this, direct and in many ways personal relationship with what they believe to be a powerful force who, they hope will help them solve real world problems. And this hands-on practical approach to spirituality mirrors what we see in a ton of different African diasporan religions where, people seek help from spirits or, dead ancestors to get through different challenging everyday needs. So the story of Santa Muerte reveals something profound about how people preserve and adapt their traditions under difficult circumstances. And what we see in her worship is not just, modern Mexican religious movement, but also a living example of how indigenous African and European spiritual practices blend together over the centuries to create something completely new, yet deeply rooted in the past. So while the media might portray Santa Muerte worship as dangerous or criminal, the reality is just, it's a little bit more complex than just that. Her followers come from many different walks of life, and they turn to her for different needs. So whether or not you believe that Santa Muerte is a real force or can actually achieve things or is maybe satanic altogether, it's important to recognize that the worship of this deity or this being or this idea is real for millions of people across Mexico. And rather than, dismissing it, I think it's worth, trying to understand what is actually happening. Is this, satanic? Part of me, growing up Catholic, is like, I get freaked out by all sorts of different types of voodoo and stuff like that. I don't mess with any of the dark arts. So to me, this one is just a little too far. But who knows? If you practice Santa Muerte and you're in the comments, I would love to know what you think. Please drop a comment. Am I completely off base here? Am I being judgmental because of my, repressed Catholic upbringing? Or is there something here that's more just like voodoo or, palomayombe? Is there something that feels dark about this? The fact that you have to offer something in order to get something back. I don't know, but maybe I'm missing it. Maybe my research here is not completely accurate. So please inform me, drop a comment. I will read all of them, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you so much. Peace. What's up, people? Quick announcement. If you are a fan of Camp Gagnon or Religion Camp, I have great news because we are dropping History Camp. That's right. This is the channel where we're going to be exploring the most interesting, fascinating, controversial topics from all time throughout all history. Right? You probably know about Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Nikola Tesla. Interesting figures from history, and you probably learned about them in school and they were pretty boring, but not here. No. As you know, I was raised by a conspiracy theorist, so I'm going to be diving deep into all of the interesting, strange, occult, and secretive societal relationships that all of these famous, influential men from our shared past have. So if you're interested, please go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It will be pinned in the description as well as the comments. And if you're on Spotify, this doesn't really apply to you, but these episodes will be dropping as well. Just go ahead and give us a high rating because it really helps the show.